Hello. Have you ever wanted to be penetrated by a vampire lady or a gentleman? I mean by their teeth on the neck. I don't know what you're thinking about. Today we are talking about Dracula by Bram Stoker. First, I'm going to tell you about the author, and right after that we'll get into the story. And as usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. Bram Stoker was an Irish author who lived and created between the 19th and 20th centuries. So this was during the Victorian era, a time when you had two options. You could either be a delicate, asexual woman or a dominant, thirsty man. And you had to be heterosexual, which was a problem for Stoker, as he allegedly had a big crush on Walt Whitman, writing him a letter that reads, "I would like to call you comrade, and to talk to you as men who are not poets do not often talk." I think that at first a man would be ashamed, for a man cannot in a moment break the habit of comparative reticence that has become second nature to him. But I know I would not long be ashamed to be natural before you. You are a true man, and I would like to be one myself, and so I would be towards you as a brother and as a pupil to his master. Stoker then kept this letter in his drawer for 4 years before writing a second letter and finally sending them both to Whitman. And he did that right on Valentine's Day. So I think it's safe to say that Stoker indeed engaged in the rainbow. He then wrote a bunch of other letters along with journal entries. This time everything was fictional and with a plot, and it was later published as a novel under the name Dracula. So now we finally begin the story, and we are inside Jonathan Harker's journal. We literally are. Here we learn that Jonathan has been traveling recently, as on the 1st of May he left Munich, went to Vienna, and then from there he got to Budapest, which is where he felt like he was leaving the West and entering the East. And it's important to note that during the 19th century, so when Stoker was writing this book, people had a lot of stereotypes about Eastern Europe. Because while the West was seen as more enlightened and progressive, the East was more dark and superstitious. Which I guess we still kind of have that. I don't know how you see Europe, but from the perspective of someone who has lived their whole life in Poland, I can tell you that we definitely still have this notion that the West is more progressive and the East is more traditional. And what's interesting in Poland itself is that you can even see this divide inside Poland, because usually the western side of Poland is seen as more progressive and the eastern side is more traditional. So it's kind of interesting how you can really see that sometimes, only sometimes. Because, you know, no country is black and white, so of course, even when you look at Poland, which I think that we are considered to be very traditional, and, you know, we have a lot of, like, family values and churches everywhere. At the same time, I've met so many progressive people in Poland that, you know, this stereotype is just a stereotype, and I know where it's coming from. At the same time, no country is really black and white, and definitely not the whole, like, eastern side of Europe can't be black and white, so yeah. And then after that, he finally gives us a glimpse into the purpose of his journey. Because he explains that while he was still in London, he visited the British Museum in order to gather some information about Transylvania, which is where he is going right now. But there he discovered that even though the town that he's traveling to, Bystřice, is a fairly well-known place, at the same time Castle Dracula is impossible to locate on any map or a book. Harker then complains in his journal that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. Hey, we got better. Then he describes his journey by the train, where he saw beautiful landscapes through the window, full of little towns, rivers, and castles on top of the hills. Following that, Harker finally reaches Bistritz as the night begins to set and we arrive at our first location. We are at the Golden Crown Hotel, where Dracula instructed Harker to go to after reaching the town. And we have here Harker, a landlady, and a landlord. They all greet each other here, and after the landlady hears Harker's name, she immediately speaks to the landlord in a foreign language. The man then leaves for a moment, and then after that he returns with a letter from Dracula. In the letter, Dracula welcomes Harker to the Carpathian Mountains and says that he's anxiously expecting him, and explains that the next day a diligence will take Harker to a place from which Dracula's carriage will then bring him to the castle. To this, Harker asks the landlord about some details, but the man now pretends that he doesn't understand Harker's language, even though they just spoke like a moment ago. And then the landlord and his wife look at each other, and they are both obviously frightened. And after a moment, the landlord mumbles that the money had been sent in a letter, and this is all they know. But Harker is not giving up, so he asks if they know anything about Count Dracula or his castle. And to this, the couple just crosses themselves and they refuse to say anything else. So now the night passes and Harker is staying in his room, preparing to leave in any minute, as suddenly the landlady comes in. And Harker immediately notices that she's acting very hysterical, as she's asking him questions like, "Must you go? Oh, young man, must you go?" To which he's like, "Yeah, I really need to leave in a moment." And in general, he doesn't really buy her emotions here, because he thinks that everyone in this town is just very superstitious. So then the landlady asks him, "Do you even know what day it is?" And he answers that, "Well, isn't it just like 4th of May?" And to this she answers, "No, no, no, no. It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what are you going to?" To this, Harker tries to comfort her, but she falls to her knees and she begs him not to go, or at least wait a couple of days. But Harker helps her to get up, and then he thanks her and he says that he really needs to go. And in response to that, she takes a crucifix from her neck and she offers it to him. And at first he doesn't really want to take it because he's Anglican and crucifix is more like Catholic, but eventually the landlady hangs it over his neck and then she leaves. Following that, we learn from Harker's journal that as he was about to leave in the carriage, the driver went up to the landlady, and as they were talking, suddenly a crowd of people appeared around them, and they were all gossiping with each other while simultaneously staring at Harker, exchanging words such as Satan, witch, and vampire. And then later, as Harker was driving away, everyone from the crowd made the sign of the cross and then pointed 2 fingers towards him. To which the driver explained that they are guarding him against the evil eye. And then during the journey in the carriage, Harker was gifted a bunch of trinkets that are supposed to guard him from evil. And after a couple of minutes, he found himself in a secluded place from which he was picked up by another carriage with coal black horses and a tall man with bright red eyes and sharp looking teeth. They traveled together for a while, and then right before midnight they finally reached the ruined castle. The driver then helped Harker out of the carriage with his strong hands, and then he placed his belongings on the ground and he disappeared into the night. So now Harker is just standing outside the castle and he doesn't really know what to do with himself because there's no bell or a knocker or anything inside, and so because of that he starts to get pretty anxious. And he's like, what sort of place had I come to and among what kind of people? I am literally just a solicitor, and I just came here to explain the purchase of a London estate to a foreigner. So like, what the hell is this? And he also mentions that Mina wouldn't be happy about this situation, and Mina is his fiancée that is still in London right now. Then suddenly his thoughts are interrupted as he hears heavy steps approaching the door from the inside. Right after that, he hears the sound of rattling chains, clanking of massive bolts, and a key being turned. Then the door swings open and within them stands a tall old man. He's described to have a long white mustache and all black clothes, and obviously this is Dracula. So then Dracula welcomes Harker and he's just standing in the door like a statue for a while. But then after a moment, Harker comes closer to him and they both shake hands. And Harker notices that Dracula's hands are very cold and very strong. And Stoker, the author of the book, really has a thing for men's hands. And it's going to be even more obvious later in the book. Dracula then grabs Harker's luggage and they both get into the castle. They walk through the hallway and into the room that was prepared for Harker. And in general, Dracula is pretty nice here because he's like, oh, you should probably freshen up a little, and when you're ready, you can join me for the supper and it's going to be nice. So thanks to this, Harker begins to relax, the previous fears leave his body, and he notices that he's actually very hungry after the journey. And so after a couple of minutes, we find ourselves inside the dining room and we have here Harker and Dracula. Dracula is just leaning against the fireplace and he gestures Harker to come and sit by the table, and he explains that he won't join him because he's still full after the dinner. So Harker sits down and he begins to eat a lot because he eats a whole roasted chicken, cheese, salad, and he also has 2 glasses of wine along with the supper. And after Harker gets full, he sits with Dracula by the fireplace. They are talking here for a couple of minutes, during which Harker notices that Dracula has pointed ears, extremely pale face, sharp teeth, and equally sharp nails. And so, as you might imagine, Harker gets pretty terrified when it comes to this observation, and he writes in his journal, I fear, I think strange things which I dare not confess to my own soul. The next day, Harker is left alone as Dracula leaves him a note informing him that he's going to be absent for the day. So Harker starts to explore the castle and he notes that there's an extreme proof of wealth everywhere around him. The table service is made of gold and the fabrics are centuries old, yet in perfect condition. But at the same time, he notices that there is no sight of servants or mirrors inside the castle. Harker then gets into a library and he finds a lot of English books here. And as he's in the middle of browsing them, suddenly Dracula appears in the room and he begins by saying that he fell in love with England thanks to those books. And then Dracula begins to talk about England, and I don't know if you know this scene from The Little Mermaid where she's like, I wanna be where the people are. But that's like literally Dracula about England. He's like, I want to walk down the streets of London and I want to just you know, be one of those guys, those English guys. That's like the biggest dream. But then Dracula adds that he still needs to learn the language. And to this, Harker is like, what do you mean? Your English is literally so good. And to this, Dracula answers, oh, thank you for the compliment, but my English is far from perfect. And in general, it seems that Dracula is pretty self-conscious because he explains that he just doesn't really want to be laughed at by the people when it comes to his language skills. So then Harker and Dracula continue their conversation and they begin to talk about the property that Dracula has bought in London. And Harker tries to explain to him like a bunch of details, but it turns out that the Dracula has studied the subject so hard that right now he knows even more than Harker. Dracula then says that he's very happy about the property being old and big, as he loves the shade and the shadow and would be alone with his thoughts when he may. And then after that he leaves the library. Now Harker describes in his journal that the longer he stays in the castle, the stranger everything becomes. First instance is that once they were having a very nice conversation by the fireplace when suddenly they heard a crowing rooster, and after that Dracula immediately excused himself and said that he has to go. And then on another occasion, Harker got up in the morning and he decided that he really needed to shave, and so he took his own little mirror and he placed it by the window. And then as he was shaving, suddenly Dracula appeared behind him, which really surprised Harker as he was not able to see Dracula's reflection in the mirror. He then kind of like looked back to see Dracula, and then he looked back in the mirror and he got so startled that he cut himself on accident. And as Dracula noticed the blood on Harker's neck, he got this weird spark in his eyes and he tried to grab Harker's throat, but he touched the crucifix on accident. And it brought Dracula back to normal in an instant, and then he was like, oh, you should be careful about hurting yourself in this country. And it's all because of this wretched thing. And he pointed to the mirror and then he grabbed it and he tossed it out of the window. And then the last weird thing is that Harker actually figured out that he's a prisoner in the castle, as once he was walking around and he figured that all of the doors are locked and bolted. Now we get into Harker's room and he's sitting here and he's obviously getting more and more anxious as he figures that there's literally no sight of anyone else in the castle, which is kind of unusual because if you are living in a castle, then you would usually have a bunch of servants around. And second of all, it seems that Dracula neither drinks nor eats. Now, as Harker is sitting and thinking about all of this, suddenly Dracula comes in and they begin to talk. At first, they talk about some stuff regarding the law and the property in London, but then Dracula is like, by the way, don't you want to write a letter to anyone? And Harker explains that, yeah, he would actually love to, but he doesn't see any way of sending it. To which Dracula says that he shouldn't really worry about this and he can just write to anyone he wishes and give the letters to Dracula. And then he grabs Harker's shoulder and he tells him that in the letters he should also add that he's going to stay in the castle for a month longer. To which Harker gets pretty nervous and he's like, this long? And Dracula says, I desire it much, nay, I will take no refusal. And he also mentions that this is Harker's duty because he came here for work-related matters and not personal ones. And now Harker doesn't really have any other choice than to agree, so he does so and he writes 2 letters, one for Mr. Hawkins, his boss, and the other one for Mina, his fiancée. Then Dracula takes his letters and as he's about to leave, he also warns him that he should never even think about sleeping anywhere in the castle outside of his own room. And then after that, Dracula leaves. Now, as Harker is left alone, he hangs his crucifix above the bed, and then after that, he looks out of the window. He observes the night sky, and he worries about the hallucinations that he begins to have after his nightly conversations with Dracula. Because he's been here for some time now, and basically the same scene repeats every night. Harker and Dracula both sit by the fireplace and they talk through the whole night, and then they hear the crowing rooster, and after that Dracula excuses himself. So basically like Hamlet, which coincidentally you can watch on my channel. And so as Harker is staring out of the window, he suddenly notices something strange. He sees Dracula's head coming out of the window far away in the distance, and then he describes, "I was at first interested and somewhat amused, for it is wonderful how small a matter will interest and amuse a man when he is a prisoner. But my very feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over the dreadful abyss, face down with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. At first I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow, but I kept looking and it could be no delusion. I saw the fingers and toes grasp the corners of the stones, worn clear of the mortar by the stress of years, and by thus using every projection and inequality move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along a wall." So obviously Harker gets pretty terrified of this whole thing, and with dread he concludes that there is no escape for him. Following that, we get a very frantic journal entry from Harker where he's panicking that he's losing his mind. He writes that if I be sane, then surely it is maddening to think that of all the fool things that lurk in this hateful place, the Count is the least dreadful to me, that to him alone I can look for safety, even though this be only whilst I can serve my purpose. And then he describes that he forced his way into one of the rooms in the castle that was previously locked, and he sat there for a couple of hours writing in his journal when suddenly he felt very sleepy. And so he remembered that Dracula ordered him to only sleep in his room, but Harker was feeling a bit rebellious, and so because of that, he lied down on the couch in the room and he drifted off. And then he's like, well, I hope that I've fallen asleep and everything that happened later was just a dream, because it was certainly very strange. And then we learned that as Harker was falling asleep, suddenly he saw 3 ladies right in front of him. 2 of the ladies had black hair and red eyes, and the third one was a blonde with piercing blue eyes. And all the 3 of them had sharp teeth and red lips. Now, the ladies were just whispering to each other for a while, as suddenly Harker felt a very deep desire towards them. Then the ladies all laughed, and the ones with red eyes urged the blonde one to come up to Harker and to be the first one to kiss him, and they promised that they will follow right after. And so as Harker was still laying down paralyzed, the blonde lady came closer to him, she bent over him, and she licked her lips like an animal. And then she started to lower herself, but instead of going for Harker's lips, she went for his throat. And as Harker felt her teeth on his neck, he waited in ecstasy. But then suddenly Dracula barged into the room and he was angry. He grabbed the blonde lady by the back of her neck, he pushed her away, and then he shushed the other women, and then he began to yell at them. And as he was yelling, he was like, "What are you doing? I forbid you from even looking at him. He belongs to me." To which the blonde lady laughed at him and she yelled back, You yourself never loved. You never love. And then the ladies all started to laugh, and to this Dracula promised to give Harker to them after he's done with him. And they were not very happy about this because they are not that patient. And so because of that, Dracula gave them a bag with a small, half-smothered child inside. And following that, Harker fainted. Now, we learn from Harker's journal that after the previous scene, he found himself inside his room and he got very confused because he was not very sure if anything truly happened. And so the next day he came back to the room, but it was locked. And so because of that, he couldn't really figure anything out. Then in the next entry, Harker once again panicked as a few days later, Dracula had asked him to write 3 letters to his boss and his fiancée. One saying that his work is nearly done and he'd soon be returning home. The second one saying that he was leaving the castle the next morning. And the last one announcing his arrival at Bistritz. And Dracula also added that all of the letters should be dated about a month ahead of the actual events. To which Harker then concluded that this has to be the span of his life, and he panicked a bit more. And then on another occasion, Harker finds out that all of his papers disappeared from his bag, as well as his suit and his overcoat that he had traveled in. Next, we move in time a bit and we are close to the date of Harker's departure, or at least according to the letters that Dracula forced him to write. And we are now inside Harker's room, and we have Harker here as he still remains a prisoner to Dracula. And he's staring through the window as he notices that there's lots of Romani people coming in and out of the castle, and he senses that something is going on. And then as he's still staring through the window, he notices Dracula in the distance going out of his own window and slithering down the wall while wearing the clothes that were stolen from Harker. And in addition to that, Dracula has a bag hanging over his shoulder, the same bag that the ladies were eating from before. And then he concludes that Dracula is probably trying to leave the evidence that Harker was seen in the town posting the letters that he was forced to write. And he also gets a bit scared here that Dracula might commit some evil deeds while dressed as him. And then as he's still staring through the window, waiting for Dracula to come back, he suddenly sees some little specks floating around in the rays of moonlight. And as he's staring at them, slowly becoming more and more hypnotized, suddenly the little specks begin to change their shape, and after a while they transform into the 3 vampire ladies from before. To which Harker escapes into the back of the room with a scream, and he hides away as he hears laughs and noises coming from the castle. Then, as everything goes silent again, Harker runs to the doors, but he finds them locked. So he comes back to the window, and now he sees a woman running towards the castle, screaming, "Monster, give me back my child." Then he sees the following scene. She threw herself on her knees and, raising up her hands, cried the same words in tones which wrung my heart. Then she tore her hair and beat her breast and abandoned herself to all the violences of extravagant emotion. Finally, she threw herself forward, and though I could not see her, I could hear the beating of her naked hands against the door. And after that, Harker hears Dracula calling in whisper from the tower, which results in a pack of wolves appearing right before the gate and devouring the poor woman. Following that, Harker decides to sneak into Dracula's room during the day in order to see what's going on there. And so he figures out a plan. He's going to sneak out of his own window, and then he will climb the walls of the castle, the lizard style, in order to reach Dracula's window. He then does just that, and he finds himself inside Dracula's room. Here, he's trying to find any sort of keys, but they are nowhere to be seen, and so because of that, he's just looking around. And as he does so, he notices a heavy door in the corner of the room. He comes closer to it, and he's like, well, I came all the way here, might as well see what's there. So he goes through them, and then he goes through a passage, and then down the stairs, and he finds himself inside an old ruined chapel, which had been evidently used as a graveyard. He then searches through a bunch of coffins, and surprise, surprise, he finds Dracula in one of them. And Harker tries to figure out if Dracula is dead or alive, but then he gets a bit scared because Dracula has this look of hate in his eyes, and so as Harker sees it, he runs away. Now, a couple of days later, Harker sits inside the library, and as he's reading a book and slowly falling asleep, suddenly Dracula comes in and he grabs him by the shoulder and says that tomorrow they have to part ways as everything has been planned in order for Harker to go back to England. To which Harker is like, well, can't I go this evening, maybe? And to this, Dracula takes him to the gate, he opens it, and as Harker is about to leave, he suddenly sees a pack of wolves outside the gate. So obviously Harker says that he will wait for tomorrow, and he comes back to his room. And here, as Harker is about to lay down for the night, he suddenly hears whispering outside his doors, and so he comes up to it and he starts to listen. And he hears Dracula's voice yelling, "Go back to your own place. Your time has yet to come. Tonight is mine. Tomorrow night is yours." And so to this, Harker gets actually mad. And so he throws the door open and he curses the vampire ladies, but they just laugh at him and they disappear into the mist. Following that, the morning finally comes and Harker hears a crowing rooster outside the window, and he gets very happy about this because this means that Dracula has gone to sleep. So Harker runs out of the castle and he comes up to the gate, and as he's trying to force it open, he figures that he needs to find the key. And he knows exactly where it is. So he climbs the castle the same way as before, the lizard style, and he quickly finds himself inside the ruined chapel. Here he searches the coffins in order to find Dracula, and as soon as he finds him, he gets very terrified because Dracula suddenly looks a lot younger. His hair is no longer white and his cheeks are full and pink. And as Harker is searching through his body looking for the key, he notices that Dracula has gouts of blood around his mouth and also a mocking smile on his lips. So Harker gets mad at the sight and he grabs a nearby shovel, and as he's about to hit Dracula with it, suddenly Dracula's face turns around and it makes Harker paralyzed, and because of that he misses. And so as Harker is thinking about his next move, suddenly he hears the Romani people coming close to the castle, and so he escapes because now he has a new plan. And he then describes that his new plan is to hide somewhere close to the gate and then run away as soon as the Romani people open it up. He tries to do that, but he fails, and so he decides that there's no way that he's staying here any longer. So he writes down that he will just try to climb the castle wall and then run towards the nearest train. And then he ends his journal entry with the words, "At least God's mercy is better than that of those monsters." So now after this we change the perspective a bit because we get a couple of letters between two women. One of them is Mina Murray, who is Harker's fiancée, and the other one is Lucy Westenra, who is Mina's friend. And we begin here with a letter from Mina to Lucy, where she writes that she's been very overwhelmed with work recently as she's an assistant schoolmistress. Mina also says here that she's been learning a lot recently as she's trying to keep up with Harker's studies And she also adds that she plans to start her own journal. And at the very end, Mina asks Lucy about the tall, handsome, curly-haired man that seems to be interested in Lucy. And now, following that, we get an answer from Lucy to Mina. Lucy writes here that nothing that interesting is really going on in her life, as she's just enjoying her time, riding horses, going to art galleries, and going for walks. And she explains that when it comes to the tall, handsome man, then yeah, his name is Mr. Holmwood, and he often comes to her house, but he's usually busy talking with her mama, so nothing really special about him. But then Lucy is like, oh, but you know what? There's actually one fine gentleman here. He is handsome, well off, and of good birth. And in addition to that, he's only 29 and he already has an immense lunatic asylum all under his own care. And then Lucy lights up a bit as she mentions Mr. Holmwood again. And as soon as she does that, she's like, okay, you know what? I need to tell you a secret, because I actually love Arthur so much. Like, he's so fine that I'm like blushing when I'm writing this. And Mina, please just pray for my happiness. And so after a couple of days, we get another letter from Lucy to Mina again. And in this one, she writes that she's very shocked because she got 3 marriage proposals in one day. The first guy that showed up was John Seward, the same guy that manages the lunatic asylum. And he was very nervous about this whole thing, and he almost sat down at his own hat. And then he was sitting with Lucy for a while in silence. And after that, he proposed to her. To which Lucy started crying, and to this, Seward immediately asked her if she maybe had someone else in her heart already. She confessed that indeed it is the case, and to this Seward took her hands in his own. He wished for her happiness and said that if she ever needs a friend, then he's always willing to be one for her. The second guy was an American from Texas named Mr. Morris. And he's like a pretty cool guy, always trying to make Lucy laugh by talking to her in American slang. But after he proposes, Lucy starts to cry again, and she's like, I would really love to be your wife because you are a cool guy, but there is someone else that's far more important to me right now. So they part ways, but Mr. Morris is very nice about this whole thing, so yeah. Then the last guy was obviously Arthur, and Lucy accepted his proposal without a second thought because she loves him very much. And also the guys are pretty sweet here, because then we also get a bunch of letters between them where they plan to meet up and celebrate that Arthur is going to be the lucky man that's going to marry Lucy. And in general, I can tell you that the relationship between the guys in the book is just so good. Like, it's so good. You're going to see later, but it's amazing. Like, I love their relationship so hard. Then we get an entry from Mina's journal where she writes that she's going to meet up with Lucy in a town near the coast called Whitby. And Mina begins by describing a landscape and the history of this place. And oh boy, she knows a lot about everything. And we also learn here that Mina is getting pretty worried as she haven't heard from Harker for a month now. Now we get into a different journal, and this time we learn what John Seward has been going through. And this is one of the guys that proposed to Lucy, the one that manages the lunatic asylum. And here he writes that he has an interesting patient named Renfield. He's a 59 years old man with great physical strength and certain qualities that are very largely developed, which are selfishness, secrecy, and a sense of purpose. Now, Seward writes in his journal that Renfield has a weird habit of keeping odd pets. First, he was catching flies, but Stewart asked him not to do this, and so then Renfield started collecting spiders instead, feeding them the flies from before. So then Stewart was like, okay, can you get rid of the spiders, please? And Renfield agreed, and then he started to feed the spiders to sparrows. Following that, Renfield asked Stewart for a cat, but he didn't get it, and so because of that, a couple of days later, he decided to eat the sparrows himself. To which Stewart concluded that Renfield is a homicidal maniac. Now, we go back into Mina's journal and we learn that she's getting increasingly anxious as, first of all, she got a letter from Harker saying that he's starting for home. But Mina doesn't really buy that because the letter is very short and to the point, while Harker usually writes very descriptive letters. And the second problem that Mina has is that Lucy has been sleepwalking recently, which is not actually new to her as she had this habit a couple of years back. So Mina contacted Lucy's mother and they both figure out that Lucy has to be locked in her room every night so that she doesn't go out and get lost and fall off the cliff or something. But Lucy doesn't seem to be too bothered about it as she's only able to think about her soon-to-be wedding and every single detail of it and how the house is going to look like and everything regarding the marriage. But a couple of days later, Mina is getting even more anxious as Lucy is now sleepwalking every single night and she seems to be looking for the key in order to get out. In addition to that, Harker is nowhere to be seen, which worries Mina tremendously. Following that, we get a fragment of a newspaper clipped into Mina's journal, and we learn from it that a large ship washed up on the shore at Whitby during a terrific storm. And while it had no crew inside, just a dead captain clasping a crucifix, as soon as the ship reached the shore, a big dog jumped out of it and disappeared into the night. And the local animal control wants to catch the dog as it's probably dangerous considering that not long after the events, some local people found another dog completely teared apart by a large animal. Then we also get a selection of captain's log from the ship where we learn that in the beginning there was actually a whole crew on the ship, but as soon as they find out that there's a strange man abroad, everyone started to slowly disappear one by one until the only person left was the captain. Following that, we find ourselves inside a bedroom that's currently shared by Mina and Lucy. And here we have Mina as she wakes up because she has this nagging feeling that she's alone in the room. So she comes close to Lucy's bed and she finds it empty. And so Mina gets pretty anxious, so she checks the doors and she figures that they are not locked, even though she remembers locking it. Then she checks Lucy's dresses because she wants to figure out what kind of dress Lucy had on when she got out of the room, and she figures that Lucy had to wear her night dress. And so after Mina realizes that, she runs out of the room and she begins to search the house because she thinks that Lucy could not possibly go out of the house just in her night dress. But to Mina's surprise, Lucy is nowhere to be found inside the house. So Mina now panics, she dresses herself and she runs out in order to find Lucy. She searches for her near the cliffs but finds no one there, and so because of that she figures that maybe Lucy went to a churchyard to sit on her favorite bench there. And she's right. She finds her here, and as she's staring at Lucy from the distance, she also notices a dark figure with pale face and red eyes bending over Lucy. Mina then runs towards the bench, and as she's getting closer, the dark figure disappears. And as Mina reaches the bench, she figures that Lucy is still deep into her sleepwalking state, and she's pulling the collar of her night dress close around her neck. To which Mina thinks that maybe she's just cold, so she gives her shawl and she fastens it with a large safety pin. And to this, Lucy puts her hand to her throat, but Mina thinks that maybe she was just not careful enough, and so because of that she hurt her with the pin. Then they come back to the bedroom and Mina locks the doors and she hangs the key around her wrist and Lucy goes to sleep. The next day, Mina starts to apologize to Lucy as she notices that Lucy's neck has 2 red points on it. And also her nightdress is covered in blood stains. And of course, Mina thinks that this is because she hurt her with the safety pin. Then after that, Mina writes down in her journal about a couple of weird situations regarding Lucy. The first one is that after a couple of days after the previous events, one night Mina woke up and she noticed that Lucy is sitting on her bed, still asleep, and she's pointing to the window. So Mina pulled aside the blinds and she noticed a large bat coming and going in circles, but as soon as the bat saw her, he flew away. Then the second weird situation happened when they were both watching the sunset, and as soon as the horizon became red, Lucy whispered, "His red eyes again, they are just the same." And then the last weird situation happened when Mina went for a walk late in the evening, and as she was walking, she suddenly saw Lucy leaning out of their window. And she was obviously deep asleep, and something that looked like a good-sized bird was sitting right next to her. Mina got scared when she saw that, so she ran towards the room, but as soon as she reached it, Lucy was already moving back to her bed while holding her hand to her throat. Following that, we get a letter from Sister Agatha to Mina. And Agatha writes from a hospital in Budapest. And guess who's here? It's Harker. He's alive, but barely, as he's been staying in the hospital for the last 6 weeks, suffering from a terrible brain fever. And Sister Agatha informs Mina that Harker had a fearful shock during which he was talking about wolves, blood, demons, ghosts, etc. And then she also explains that they didn't contact Mina before because they didn't really know who Harker was, as he was taken there from a train where he was yelling that he wants to go home. Following that, we go back to Seward's journal and we learn here that the strange patient, Renfield, got even weirder. One day, Renfield said that he doesn't want to talk to anyone anymore as his master is coming, and so after a couple of days, Renfield escaped through the window. So Seward obviously ran after him and he found him pressed against the iron door of an old chapel. And Renfield seemed to speak to someone as he said, "I am here to your bidding, master. I am your slave, and you will reward me, for I shall be faithful. I have worshipped you long and afar off. Now that you are near, I await your commands, and you will not pass me by, will you, dear master, in your distribution of good things?" But then, after he said that, Seward immobilized him with a couple of other medical assistants, and they all locked him in a padded room, chained to the wall and restrained by a straight waistcoat. Then after that, we get 2 letters between Mina and Lucy. The first letter is from Mina, where she writes that she managed to get to Budapest and Harker is in a pretty bad state, but he's getting better with every day, as one day he gave Mina the journal that he kept while he was in Dracula's castle, and he allowed her to read it, but under one condition, which is that she should never speak to him about what's in the journal. But to this, Mina just placed the journal under the pillow, and she decided to marry Harker right here and now. They married, and right after that, Mina sealed the journal with a wax and said that she will only open it if absolutely necessary. Then Lucy sends her a letter back with congratulations, and she says that she's feeling a bit better than before, and also that Arthur came to visit her family in Whitsby, so she's very happy about this. Following that, we go back to Seward's journal and we learn that Renfield became very quiet recently, just sitting and murmuring to himself, "Now I can wait." And Seward also notices that Renfield began to change his mood depending on the time of the day. He's very violent throughout the whole day, and then he gets quiet from moonrise to sunrise. And so Seward comes up with a plan, because he figures that maybe he should let Renfield escape again and he can follow him and see what's going to happen and where Renfield is going to go to. The plan works out, and Seward finds Renfield pressed again against the chapel door. But this time Renfield notices Seward and his assistants, and so he charges towards them, but they manage to strangle him as they all see a big bat flying away from the scene. Following that, we unlock a new journal, this time kept by Lucy, as she decided to imitate Mina and write everything down. And currently she's in a different city than before, and for the last couple of days she's been feeling very weak, tired and scared. And she also adds that she really needs to get herself together, as Arthur is going to visit her very soon. And right after that, we get a letter from Arthur to Seward asking him to come and see Lucy, as her health is getting worse with every day. He does so, and he concludes that even though Lucy seems a little bloodless, at the same time, she doesn't show any other signs of anemia. And so because of that, Seward suggests that maybe there's something wrong with her mind, as she's been having a lot of nightmares recently. Then Seward says that he will write to his old friend, Professor Van Helsing, who knows a lot about obscure diseases, and he will ask him to come here and check Lucy's health. Following that, we get into Lucy's room, and we have here Lucy, Van Helsing and Seward. And Lucy looks a bit better here, as she's trying her best to be very hospitable towards the professor, but both men can see that she's struggling with it. And at the beginning they talk about everything except diseases, but then after a while Van Helsing is like, "Oh, you know, I heard that you've had a problem with your pale cheeks recently." And so the professor asks more about her health now, and after a while he finally examines her, and he concludes that even though she seems to have lost a lot of blood recently, she doesn't seem anemic. So now a couple of days pass and we are back in Lucy's room. We have Lucy here, who is even more pale than before, with the bones on her face prominent and her breath very heavy. Then Van Helsing comes in with Seward and they get terrified as soon as they see Lucy's state. So Van Helsing beckons Seward to leave the room and they both do so. And they begin to talk about Lucy's state here, and Van Helsing gets worried that they need to immediately transfuse some blood into Lucy's body. And as they wonder who's going to be the one that will give Lucy blood, suddenly they hear a noise coming from the doorway, and right after that Arthur appears in the hallway. He thanks the professor for coming and checking on Lucy, and he asks about her state, to which Van Helsing tells him that it's so good that he came right now because they need his help. To which Arthur is like, "What can I do? Tell me and I shall do it. My life is hers and I would give the last drop of blood in my body for her." To which Van Helsing is like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa. My young sir, I do not ask for this much." And then he tells him about the blood transfusion that's needed in order to keep Lucy alive. So obviously Arthur agrees and they all come into Lucy's room. They then transfuse the blood from Arthur to Lucy, and after that Arthur feels a bit weak, and so because of that Seward takes him downstairs and he gives him something strong to drink and he lies him down. And here Van Helsing notices the 2 red marks on Lucy's throat. Then Seward comes back and he asks the professor what does he think about the marks, and he says that he's not very sure and he also needs to go back to Amsterdam for a while because he needs to gather some books that are going to help him with this case. And Van Helsing asks Seward to stay here for the night and keep an eye on Lucy. And he adds that after he comes back from Amsterdam, they might start, but he doesn't elaborate on what he means by that. Now, 2 days pass by and Lucy starts to feel better as she doesn't even have the nightmares anymore. But then on the 3rd night, Lucy feels so good that she insists on Seward sleeping in another room next to her own as she gets a bit worried about him looking very worn out. He agrees because he indeed is enormously tired and so he falls asleep. Now, the next day, Seward is woken up by Van Helsing, who just got back from Amsterdam. They both go into Lucy's room and Van Helsing gets terrified as Lucy seems to be even more pale than before and her gums have shrunken back so that her teeth look like fangs now. They then check Lucy's pulse and it seems to be very weak, and so because of that, Van Helsing decides that they need to transfuse Seward's blood into her. They do so, and after that, Lucy seems to kind of get back to normal again. So then Van Helsing decorates her room with white garlic flowers that are supposed to protect her while she's asleep. And later, as the night begins to set, Van Helsing hangs a wreath of garlic around Lucy's neck and he forbids her from opening the windows during the night. She happily agrees, saying that she feels a bit like Ophelia from Hamlet, and then she falls asleep as the guys leave her room. But then, the next day, Lucy's mother says that, oh, you know, Lucy for sure has to feel better right now because mother knows best. And so she describes that during the night she went into Lucy's room and she saw a bunch of smelly flowers there. And so she took them all and she threw them all away. And then she opened the windows in order to let in some fresh air. So after hearing this, Van Helsing rushes into Lucy's room and he finds her lifeless here. So once again, he has to transfuse blood into her, this time his own. And after that, he makes sure that Lucy will be guarded every single night from this point on. Following that, we get a short fragment from a local newspaper where they write that a wolf has recently escaped the zoo. And a zookeeper says that the day before the wolf disappeared, a strange man was seen hanging around the zoo. It was Dracula. And the man was just casually petting the wolf, which surprised the zookeeper as this wolf was one of the scariest ones from the pack. Then the next day, the zookeeper found the wolf's cage with its rails broken and twisted. And then as the interviewer is still talking to the zookeeper, suddenly the wolf returns with its head all cut and full of broken glass. Now we get back to Seward's journal and we learn here that as Seward was sitting in his office, suddenly Renfield burst the doors open, barged in and lunged at Seward with a kitchen knife in his hand. Seward tried to avoid the knife, but Renfield still managed to cut his wrist, making him bleed. Then as the medical assistants came into the room, Renfield began to lick the blood off of the floor and he was screaming, "The blood is the life." Next, we get an entry from Lucy's journal where she writes that as she was sleeping, she was suddenly woken up by a sound of flapping wings outside her window. So, as you might imagine, she gets pretty anxious about this whole situation, and so because of that, she gets too scared to sleep alone in her room, and so she opens her doors and she yells, "Is there anybody there?" But she gets no answer, and so because of that, she closes the doors again, and as soon as she does that, she hears a howl coming from the outside. So she comes up to the window, but she only sees a bat that's trying to fly into her room. And then Lucy's mother comes in and she asks if there's anything wrong because she heard Lucy walking around her room. So they talk here for a while, and then suddenly the window crashes. A lot of broken glass falls onto the floor, and as the window blind blows back, they see a head of a great grey wolf. Now, Lucy's mother gets terrified here, and in fact, she gets so terrified that she dies from a heart attack. So Lucy is now left alone, and she ends her journal by writing, "My dear mother is gone. It is time that I go too. Goodbye, dear Arthur, if I should not survive this night. God keep you dear, and God help me." Next, we go back to Seward's journal, where he describes that the next morning, after the events from Lucy's journal, he and Van Helsing came into her house and they found her barely alive with 2 red marks on her neck. So the guys started to revive her, and first they gave her a hot bath, after which they laid her down on the bed and poured a few drops of brandy down her throat. Now, they talk about Lucy's state here, and Van Helsing is like, okay, so she obviously needs another transfusion, but we are not able to do this right now because of how much blood we've already given her, so we really need someone that would offer Lucy his blood. And to this, the someone appears in the form of Mr. Morris, the guy from Texas that was one of the men that proposed to Lucy. He says that he got a letter from Arthur where he wrote that he's not able to come right now because his father is very sick, so he has to stay with him, but he wished for Morris to go and check on Lucy, and so this is why he's here right now. So now they all hurry and they transfuse Morris's blood into Lucy, and after that she begins to feel better. But later they figure that she's not really coming back to normal because she's very afraid to fall asleep, and she looks like she's basically dying, and then also her teeth look a lot sharper and longer than usual. She then asks to see Arthur, so he immediately travels to be by her side, and as soon as she walks into the room and sees Lucy's state, he begins to choke with emotion. And then after a while he composes himself a little because it seems that Lucy feels a bit better after seeing him. Following that, we get a short letter from Mina to Lucy where she writes that she's going to come with Harker to England in a matter of days. But we also get a note here that this letter was unopened by Lucy. Next, we go back into Lucy's room and we learn here that everyone is still here and everyone is taking turns watching over her, as they all sense that those are her last moments. Then during the night they notice that the marks on Lucy's throat seemed to have disappeared, and so because of that Van Helsing concludes that she's going to die pretty soon. So to this, Arthur comes into the room and Lucy lightens up a bit when she sees him, but then as he comes closer to her, her state changes a bit. Her mouth opens, showing her long and sharp teeth. Then her gaze becomes very dull and sharp at once, and her tone becomes very soft and sensual as she says, "Arthur, oh my love, I am so glad you have come. Kiss me." So Arthur leans in to do as she wishes, but then right as he does that, Van Helsing and Seward drag him back, and the professor forbids him from kissing Lucy anywhere but on her forehead. Arthur complies, he kisses Lucy on her forehead, and then she dies. To which Arthur is just devastated. He covers his face with his hands and he begins to sob like crazy. So Seward leads him away into another room, and after a while, Seward comes back. And I just want to say that I love the relationship between the guys in the book. It's so like healthy, and I love how they care about one another's emotions. It's great, and it's going to get even better, and really it feels like almost like a brotherhood in a sense. It's so nice to see. But yeah, going back to the story, after Seward comes back into the room, he sees that Lucy looks a lot better after she died. Almost as if she looked dead while she was alive, but now she looks asleep as she's dead. And to this, Van Helsing says very mysteriously that this is only the beginning and now they have to wait. Following that, we get a description of Lucy's funeral, and we learn that Van Helsing is really not taking any chances. Because as soon as they all notice how alive and beautiful Lucy looks like, Van Helsing places lots of garlic flowers inside her coffin and a gold crucifix over her mouth. Then later, the professor tells Seward that after the funeral, they have to operate on Lucy by cutting off her head and taking out her heart. To which Seward is obviously shocked, but Van Helsing convinces him that this is necessary and that he should actually prepare himself for a lot more to come. Following that, we learn from Seward's journal that the next morning Van Helsing appeared visibly angry in his room. And he said that someone took the golden crucifix from Lucy's mouth, and so because of that, everything is lost and they can't go forward with the plan. And Seward also writes here that from this point, Van Helsing has been watching over Lucy's corpse every single night. Following that, we get into Mina's journal, and she writes here that recently she arrived with Harker in London and they had a very strange encounter there. Because one time, as they were walking through the streets of London, suddenly Harker noticed a man in the distance and he pointed at him, and then he turned pale with terror. Mina looked where he was staring at, and she noticed a tall, thin man with sharp teeth and bloody red lips. After that, Harker yelled, "It is the man himself," and he started to panic, yelling that this has to be Dracula. But surprisingly, a much younger Dracula. Mina then dragged him into a park, sat him down on a bench, and then Harker fell asleep for about half an hour. And when he woke up, he had completely forgotten about what had just happened. And at this point, Mina decided that she has to read the journal that Harker kept while he was staying at Dracula's castle. Following that, we get a fragment from a newspaper with a very interesting story. It turns out that recently there has been a series of strange events where children fail to come home at night and then they return in the morning claiming that they were with the bluffer lady. And all of the children that go missing return with wounds on their throats. Next, we return to Mina's journal, where she writes that she has read every entry from Harker's time in the castle. And she doesn't really know what to believe here, because after all, Harker has suffered with a brain injury, so maybe he just imagined all of that. And then she gets a letter from Van Helsing in which she reads that the professor wants to meet with her as he read in Lucy's journal about their friendship. She agrees, and after a couple of days, Van Helsing shows up in her house. They begin to talk here, and after exchanging a few words about Lucy, Mina gives him a journal that she kept during her stay at Whitby. The professor then begins to read it as Mina leaves the room in order to prepare something for lunch. Now, Van Helsing gets pretty emotional here, and as Mina comes back into the room, he takes her by her hands and he thanks her because the journal opened his eyes and gave him the last puzzle. To which Mina is like, wait, there's more. And she gives him the journal that Harker kept while he was in Transylvania. The professor then leaves with the journal as it's getting pretty late now, and they decide to meet again tomorrow. Following that, we have a short letter from Van Helsing to Mina where he writes that he can assure her that everything from Harker's journal is true. And so after that, we finally go back into Harker's journal. Long time no see. And he writes here that he feels like a new man after finding out that everything that happened to him in the castle was true. And so we learn that his previous state was caused by his confusion about his stay in Transylvania. But after being reassured, he and Mina decide to join Van Helsing in his quest to find out the truth about Lucy's death. Next, we find ourselves in Seward's office, and we have here Seward, and we see Van Helsing coming in. And then the professor begins by showing Seward a newspaper with an article about the bluffer lady that kidnaps children and leaves them with wounds on their necks. Van Helsing asks Seward what does he think about this, and Seward answers that it appears that what killed Lucy is now hurting those children. To which Van Helsing says that it is only partially true, and then he goes into a big monologue about how science is making a mistake by wanting to explain all, and if it explains not, then it says there's nothing to be explained. And then after that, Van Helsing says that maybe what left the marks on children's necks was actually Lucy. And Seward is not happy about this. He hits the table with his fist and he asks if Van Helsing is perhaps mad. But the professor eases him a bit by saying that it's actually very hard for him as well, because he was suspecting Lucy for some time now, but he didn't even want to speak about this theory out loud. So now Seward calms down and Van Helsing tells him that he has a plan. First, they need to go and see the child in the hospital, and then later they need to go to the cemetery in order to spend the night there. And Seward agrees because he doesn't really have any other choice, to be honest. They go to the hospital and they confirm there that the child indeed has the same spots on the neck as Lucy did. And then the child also repeats the story about the bluffer lady. After that, they go to the churchyard, they get into Lucy's tomb, they open her coffin, and they find it empty. So now Van Helsing is like, how do you explain this? And to this, Seward answers, well, I mean, maybe there was a body snatcher here. To which Van Helsing just sighs and he takes Seward outside. So now we are in a churchyard with Van Helsing and Seward as they both hide away and they begin to wait. And after a couple of hours of waiting, Seward finally sees a white streak moving between the trees, but the figure quickly disappears as it gets closer to Lucy's tomb. Then Seward looks at Van Helsing and he notices that the professor is holding a tiny child in his arms. They check the child and they figure that it doesn't have the red marks on the throat. And to this, Seward is like, was I right? but Van Helsing tells him that they were just in time in order to save the child. They then leave the churchyard, carrying the child to a safe place. Now, the next day, Seward and Van Helsing come back to the churchyard because they want to check on Lucy's coffin again. And Seward is like, do we really have to? Because he's sure that the coffin will remain empty. They get into the tomb, they open the coffin, and surprise, surprise, Lucy is here, and she looks even healthier than before, almost as if she was not dead at all. So now Van Helsing finally says that everything can be explained if we consider the possibility of vampires existing. And then he adds that they need to kill Lucy by cutting her head off, filling her mouth with garlic, and driving a stake through her body. Seward is obviously shocked by this, but he slowly starts to believe the professor. Then Van Helsing says that they are not able to do all of this right now because they need help. And so because of that, they're going to come back here tomorrow with Morris and Arthur. So now we change the location and we are in Van Helsing's room. And as the professor sits here enjoying his time, suddenly Arthur and Morris come in. They begin to talk here, and Van Helsing asks Arthur for a permission in order to do what's good this night. And to this, Arthur is like, well, I can't really make that promise until you swear that it won't violate my honor as a gentleman and my faith as a Christian. The professor accepts his limitations, and after that, Arthur grants him the permission that he wanted to have. To which Van Helsing is like, great, so we need to get into the churchyard, we need to enter Lucy's tomb, and then open her coffin. In response, Arthur gets pretty shocked and he's like, what the actual, no? And then Van Helsing asks, may I cut off the head of dead Miss Lucy? To which, as you might imagine, Arthur is shocked and he yells that he will never give his consent to something like this. But Van Helsing eases him and he says that in that case, they need to go to the churchyard in order for Arthur to see for himself why is this so important. So they all go to the churchyard during the night and they open Lucy's coffin and they find nothing in it. And after that, Van Helsing seals the doors of the tomb with communion wafers so that the undead Lucy won't be able to enter. So now at the churchyard, the four men hide away around the tomb and they wait. After a couple of minutes, a white figure appears in the distance with a child close to her. She comes closer and the men notice that it's clearly Lucy, but she's changed now, as the sweetness was turned to adamantine, hurtless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. Now they all come out of the hiding and they are standing right in front of the tomb's doors as Van Helsing rises up his lantern that lightens up Lucy's face, showing her lips that are now crimson with fresh blood that trickles down her chin. They get scared and Lucy draws back, hissing at the men. Then she pushes the child to the ground and she starts to growl over it like a dog, and to this Arthur yells and he falls to his knees. And as soon as Lucy notices him, she begins to move towards him, tempting Arthur to get even closer to her. He quickly gives in, but then Van Helsing runs between them and he holds his golden crucifix right in front of Lucy's face, to which her face becomes full of rage and she runs towards the tomb, but as soon as she gets close to it, she suddenly stops, almost as if some invisible force wouldn't let her go any further. She stands there for a while, caught between the crucifix and the doors that are sealed with the communion wafer. And after a moment of silence, Van Helsing asks Arthur again for his permission to do what needs to be done. Arthur agrees, feeling that he doesn't really have any other choice. And to this, Van Helsing comes up to the doors, he removes some of the wafer from it, and as soon as Lucy slips into the tomb, he seals it again. Then the professor decides that they will do what they have to do tomorrow, and after that everyone leaves. The following evening, everyone comes back to the churchyard dressed in all black and with a bag full of needed tools. They get into Lucy's tomb, they open her coffin, and Van Helsing starts to prepare everything that's necessary. Then they all agree that Arthur should be the one to drive the stake through Lucy. And with a heavy heart, he agrees, and he takes the stake and a hammer in his hand. He then places the sharp point of the stake over her heart, and he begins to hammer it in with all of his force. The undead Lucy begins to scream, but that doesn't stop Arthur, and so after a few more strokes, her body becomes stiff and she finally truly dies. Now, as you might imagine, Arthur is just devastated by all of this. He falls to his knees and he begins to cry with broken gasps as the other men stare into the coffin, looking at Lucy, who now seems to be back to her old appearance, her face full of sweetness and purity. Arthur then rises, he kisses Lucy's forehead one last time, and after that Morris takes him out of the tomb. Then Van Helsing and Seward finish what they started. They cut Lucy's head off and then fill her mouth with garlic. After that, they close her coffin, they get out of the tomb, they lock it, and then they give the key to Arthur. And so after all of this, Van Helsing tells the men that there's still one more thing to do, because currently he's on a trail of a much bigger threat. Kowódki! Yeah. Following that, we get into Seward's office and he's talking here to his phonograph. Then, right as he's doing so, Mina comes into the room and she's like, "Oh, I thought you were talking to someone." To which Seward answers that no, he's just keeping his journal on the phonograph. And Mina gets interested in that, so she asks him if he would allow her to listen to some of the tapes, but he gets a bit embarrassed about this because this is more like his private diary. And so Mina then asks him to tell her about Lucy's death, as they were very close, almost like sisters. But he doesn't really want to answer, and so because of this, Mina senses that something is not right about this whole thing. As Seward tries to change the subject, saying awkwardly that, "Oh, you know, I've been keeping this journal for so many months now, but I never really thought about how I'm going to search for a specific part if I ever want to." And to this, Mina tells him that she can make him a copy on a typewriter because she really wants to know how did Lucy die. But to this, he's like, no, there's no need for that. That was a terrible story. And this confirms Mina's suspicions about Lucy's death not being so peaceful. Then she looks around the room and she notices that Seward has two journals here. Her own journal from her stay at Whitby and Harker's journal from his time in the castle. So she says, "You don't know me," and she explains that after reading the journals, Seward is going to understand her better and also trust her. He agrees with her and he proposes that he will start reading her journal while at the same time he will play her some of the tapes of his diary. And so they begin to do just that. Then we get for a moment into Seward's journal and he writes here about two things. The first one is that as Mina got through his diary, she started to cry and said that it needs to be written down on a typewriter. And the second one is that Seward started to suspect that his weird patient, Renfield, might have something to do with this whole vampire case. Because it turns out that Dracula's house in London is right in front Seward's asylum. So once again, we are inside Seward's office and we have here Van Helsing, Seward, Mina, Harker, Arthur, and Morris. Van Helsing begins by asking if everyone knows the content of the journals laid before them. And we have here Mina's journal from Whitby, Harker's journal from his stay in Dracula's castle, and Seward's diary. Everyone confirms that they've read them, and after that, Van Helsing starts to explain the nature of vampires. He calls them Nosferatu and says that one of them has the strength of 20 men, is incredibly cunning, has power over the elements, and has the ability to change its shape however it wants. And as Van Helsing is explaining everything, we get a very nice description, and I'm going to read it to you, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. Whilst he was speaking, Jonathan had taken my hand. I feared, oh so much, that the appealing nature of our danger was overcoming him when I saw his hand stretched out. But it was life to me to feel its touch, so strong, so self-reliant, so resolute. A brave man's hand can speak for itself. It does not even need a woman's love to hear its music. And so I just wanted to read it to you because I find it so incredibly cute, especially considering Stoker's sexual orientation. I feel like sometimes in Dracula you get those fragments where you really see how much Stoker loved men, and it's just so cute and like, I don't know, it's nice. It's nice to read that. But going back to the story, Van Helsing says that he knows that everyone here is very young, and so he doesn't expect them to join his mission. But then we basically get like a Lord of the Rings scene of you have my sword, my bow, and my axe. And so to this, Van Helsing starts to point out vampires' weaknesses, which are that they are not able to enter a house without a permission, they are only able to change their shape at noon or during sunrise or sunset, and they are sensitive for garlic and the sight of crucifix. And while Van Helsing keeps talking, Morris is staring through the window, and after a while he gets up and he leaves the room. But Van Helsing continues as he now explains that Dracula can only rest in a soil mixed with blood and ashes of his ancestors. And they know that a couple of boxes full of earth had been transported into the mansion next to the asylum. Then everyone hears a pistol shot and the glass of the window shatters from a bullet. Everyone gets up, Arthur comes up to the window, and they hear Morris's voice coming from below, yelling, "Sorry, I'll explain in a second." And so he comes back and says that while the professor was explaining everything, he suddenly saw a large bat in the window, and because he's not very fond of them right now, because of the whole situation with the vampires, he came out in order to shoot it. But unfortunately, he missed, and the bat flew away into the forest. And so now Van Helsing explains that they need to find the boxes with the soil in them and either kill Dracula while he sleeps in them, or sterilize the earth so that he won't be able to seek safety in them. And the professor also adds that from this point, Mina should stay away from this whole thing because she's just too precious for them to lose. Then we get a short entry from Seward where he describes that he went with the boys to the asylum in order to check on Renfield, and they found him in a very weird state. Because suddenly Renfield started to behave like a completely normal human being, and he started saying that he wants to leave the asylum during this night. But Seward obviously didn't agree to that, and so in response, Renfield started to beg him, yelling that they don't know what they're doing and that not letting him go will only cause them more trouble. And to this, Seward just told him to lie down on the bed in order to cool down. Next, we learned that the guys passed the wall of Dracula's house and they went for the chapel there. And as they were getting closer to the doors, Van Helsing gave them silver crucifixes and garlic flowers to put around their necks. So now they all get inside and they begin to search the house. And one thing that everyone notices immediately after entering the house is the horrible odor inside. They walk around for a while and then they discover the boxes with the soil inside, but they figure that there's only 29 out of 50 left here. But shortly after they find them, the house suddenly becomes swarmed with rats. And so because of that, they all run away. So now we get into Harker's journal and we learn that a few days after the previous events, he did some investigation and figured that 12 of the remaining boxes with earth that were not in the house were deposited in 2 houses in London. And he also writes in the journal that Mina is sleeping soundly next to him, but she's very pale. And so he also adds that she will probably feel better in her own home. Now we are inside Seward's journal and we learn here that one night he went into Renfield's room, as he was called there, and he found him in a puddle of blood with terrible injuries. And as Renfield became conscious again, Van Helsing, Morris, and Arthur came into his room and they were all terrified by his state. Then after a couple of minutes, Renfield started to talk and he said that he's aware that he's dying, but first he needs to tell them something before he's gone. And so he explained that the night when he begged to be set free, he came into the window in the form of a mist. And it turns out that Dracula has been coming to Renfield's window for some time now, and he was promising things not in words but in actions, by which he means that the vampire was providing him the flies, spiders, and other living creatures in exchange for Renfield granting him the permission to enter the asylum. But then, as Dracula was granted the entrance, he stopped caring for Renfield completely and he just started to walk around the asylum. Then, as the vampire got out, Renfield noticed Mina in the distance and he figured that Dracula has been taking the life out of her. So everyone gets obviously terrified at this confession, and Renfield continues saying that he got very mad at Dracula for hurting Mina, and so when he saw him in the form of the mist, he grabbed him, and after that they started to fight, which resulted in Dracula basically smashing Renfield's body a couple of times against the floor, hence the state that he's in right now. So now they all run towards Harker's room in the asylum, and as soon as they barge in, they see a horrifying scene. Harker is laying down unconscious as Mina is kneeling down by the bed with a tall, thin man right beside her. And the man is holding Mina by her neck as he makes her drink blood off his chest. And as soon as Dracula notices them, he pushes Mina back to the bed and then he charges at them, but they all take their crucifixes out, and so because of that the vampire gets scared and he disappears in the form of a mist. Now Arthur runs out of the room because this is just too much for him, and Morris goes after him. And after a couple of minutes, Harker regains consciousness, and as soon as he sees Mina, he panics and he yells, "Oh my gosh, what in the world has happened? Guys, you take care of Mina and I'm going to go and catch this monster." But to this, Mina is like, "No way, you are not going anywhere, you are going to stay here with me." So of course, he stays. And after that, Morris and Arthur come back and they say that Renfield has died and Dracula destroyed Seward's journals. And after this, Mina begins to tell her story about Dracula coming to her and drinking her blood. After which he told her that from this time she will have to obey him and come to his every call. And following that, he opened a vein on his chest with his sharp nails and he forced Mina to drink some of his blood. So now we get a short entry from Harker's journal where he writes that after everything that has happened to Mina, they've decided to allow her to join them. And Harker explains that they've decided to sterilize all of Dracula's boxes with earth, but before they leave, they need to make sure that Mina is safe. So in order to do that, they secure her door with garlic flowers, and then Van Helsing comes up to her and he touches her forehead with the communion wafer. But right after he does that, Mina begins to scream because it turns out that the wafer burns the skin on her forehead just like a piece of white hot metal. To which Mina starts yelling that she's unclean, and to this Harker hugs her and Van Helsing starts to calm them down. Not long after that, the guys enter Dracula's mansion again and they open up each of the boxes and they sterilize it. After that, they travel to the other mansion that's owned by Dracula and they find the rest of the boxes there and they sterilize them as well. But they figure that one of the boxes is actually missing. And as they search the house for the last box, suddenly Dracula appears in the mansion, but he's pretty powerless during the day, and so because of that, he runs away after he sees that the men have gathered here. Then everyone comes back to the asylum for the night, and Mina says something interesting here, because she's like, you know what? When you really look at it, then killing the vampire Lucy was actually an act of compassion because it was done in order to free the real Lucy's soul. And so because of that, maybe we should actually look at Dracula the same way, because he was a human in the past, so it would be better to kill him with the intention of pity and not hate. Following that, it's the next day, very early in the morning, and we are in Harker's room in the asylum. We have here Harker and Mina, and she's waking him up because she came up with a plan. But she needs Van Helsing for it, and so Harker quickly leaves the room and then he comes back with the professor. And so now Mina explains that because of her weird vampire connection with Dracula, they should be able to figure out where Dracula is at if they manage to hypnotize Mina. So Van Helsing does that, and after a while he begins to ask Mina questions. The first one is, what do you see? And she answers that everything is black around her. So then he asks, what does she hear? And to this she says that she hears lapping of water and sea waves. So Van Helsing is like, oh, so you are on a ship? And Mina confirms that it is, in fact, the case. So now we know where Dracula is, and Van Helsing concludes that he's most definitely sailing towards Transylvania in order to hide in his castle. So now we get into Mina's journal and we learn that Van Helsing did some investigation and he figured out that Dracula is in fact sailing towards his castle. But the journey is going to take him some time, and so because of that, they're going to catch up with him if they go by land. Following that, we learn that they all decided to travel to Transylvania by train, hypnotizing Mina from time to time in order to keep an eye on Dracula and make sure that he's still traveling by the water. But then, as they're getting closer and closer, Mina starts to feel pretty bad and she's getting even more pale than before. And in response to that, Van Helsing tests his suspicions, and so he draws a circle around Mina and then he breaks and spills some wafers across the circle. And after that, he tells Mina to come closer to him, but it turns out that she's not able to leave the circle. And so because of that, Van Helsing decides to leave Mina in the circle as he continues his mission. Following that, we get a description of Van Helsing getting into Dracula's castle and finding himself inside the chapel, the same one in which Harker found Dracula at the beginning of the book. Here, the professor finds a couple of coffins, and the 3 of them are actually occupied by the vampire ladies that were trying to seduce Harker at the beginning. But because they are all deep asleep, Van Helsing comes closer to the last box that contains the special soil, and he crushes some of the communion wafer into it, banishing Dracula from his last place of hiding. Then he comes closer to the vampire ladies and he repeats the process of forcing a stake through their bodies and then cutting their heads off. And at the very end, Van Helsing secures the doors of the castle with the communion wafer, forbidding Dracula from entering his own lair. Following that, we learn that as Dracula's body was being carried inside a box on a cart driven by the Romani people, suddenly Harker, Morris, Arthur and Seward surrounded them. Then they flinged the box to the ground, they forced it open, and they saw Dracula in it. Laying in the soil, his face deathly pale, just like a waxen figure, and his eyes red and full of hate. And just as Dracula stared at them with a look of triumph, suddenly Harker slashed his throat and Morris pushed his knife into the vampire's heart. And after that, Dracula's body turned into dust and passed from their sight. Now everyone comes close and obviously they get very happy because they defeated Dracula. But it turns out that Morris has been fatally wounded. So he just points out that the scar from Mina's forehead has vanished, and so because of that she's not going to become a vampire. And after that, Morris dies. Then at the very end, we get a short note from Harker where he writes that 7 years after the events, him and Mina had a child that they named Quincy, because that was Morris's name. And he also adds that both Arthur and Seward managed to get married, so they're also pretty happy. But he points out that no original copies of the journals exist because Dracula destroyed them, and so because of that, no one is going to believe them if they ever tell the story. To which now Van Helsing adds, "We want no proofs, we ask none to believe us. This boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already he knows her sweetness and loving care. Later on he will understand how some men so loved her that they did dare much for her sake." And with that, we end the story. So that was the whole story of Dracula. Did you like it? It was definitely a bit different because of the way that it was written. Like, it has so many journal entries and like newspapers and letters and everything, so it was kind of hard to do like in this format that I have here. Or maybe not hard, I don't know if hard is the right word, but it was definitely different, and so yeah. So I definitely have to tell you that I struggled with this video, and I hope that you still liked it, even though I feel like it doesn't really have this many like cohesive scenes that I usually have on the channel. Yeah, it was a bit different, but I hope that you liked it. And it's important to note that Dracula touches upon the idea of submission, of course, because of how dominant the vampires are. And it also talks about the roles of women in the Victorian era, because you can basically see like the 3 types of women here. You have Lucy, who is very submissive and like delicate and pure. Then you have Mina, who is kind of similar, I would say, but at the same time she's getting like, you know, she's actually learning and she's working, so she's getting more liberated because of that, because she doesn't really need to be with Harker, you know, because while Lucy has to have a husband, kind of, Mina doesn't really have to because she's working, and so, you know, a husband is just an addition. And then of course we have the third type of a woman, which is more seductive and evil type, that's presented as the vampire ladies from the castle, and also Lucy after she gets transformed. And it's also interesting to point out that they hate children because the vampire ladies feed off children, and so it's kind of like, you know, they don't really have any sort of motherly instinct in them. And so yeah, you can let me know, what do you think about this? Because I feel like if I go into a whole essay about what do I think about those types of women, then you are only going to get my perspective on it, and I don't really want that here. You know, like I can tell you what I think, but at the same time I don't want it to be, I want us to concentrate on what's actually in the book, and the interpretations are up to us, you know, like I have my own, you can have your own, it can be different, and it's very fine. It's good to have different interpretations. But I guess that at the end I can spice it up a bit by talking about my opinion a bit, just a bit, because I don't know if this take is like controversial or not. I have no idea actually. But when it comes to how I feel about the women in the book, I actually love the type of a woman that's presented by Lucy. You know, this like gentle and like just sweet and caring, like, I don't know, there's just something in it that I love so very much. And so I know that this view is very outdated, probably, but I love those type of women, which doesn't mean that I don't love the liberated type of women. But you know, just like this, there's just something to it. Like when I was reading Dracula and there were scenes with Lucy, just amazing. She was amazing. So yeah, but that's really all you're getting from me, because I don't even have a voice anymore, and so it's very hard to speak right now. So I hope that you forgive me for the outro not being too long. I feel like this is the theme in my channel right now, because I don't know, I just like to do it like this, so it's going to be like this probably. So yeah, if you're still watching, then thank you so much, and you can subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be very happy about this. But right now we are ending. This is the end. Bye.